50-year-old IT specialist Craig Rideout
Hello.
shares a special bond with sister Robin.
How are the kids?
Yeah, the kids are fine.
Growing up, it was very much family-oriented. My brother is a fun guy. My kids adored my brother.
Craig married wife Laura in 1993 and started a family of his own. Eldest son Colin was followed by 3 girls and 3 more boys, including middle son Alex.
My brother and sister-in-law had 7 kids, and through having a lot of kids comes occasionally some financial difficulties. So he worked a lot of hours, and as such, almost became an absentee father. That got difficult. In 2014, Craig was presented with divorce papers. He was living his life to take care of his youngest kids that it was looking like he was going to be getting sole custody of, and was hoping to build bridges with the older kids. He was doing everything in his power to be the kind of parent that those kids would need.
Robin helps Craig whenever she can, and now they're closer than ever.
Over the past 2 years of him going through his divorce, we were constantly talking. I've got an attorney's appointment here, I've got a doctor's appointment here with the kids, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, what's going on for Mom's birthday? We were always talking.
Police emergency.
My brother has not been answering texts or cell phone calls or emails, and I could be making a mountain out of a molehill.
On the morning that he didn't answer his work phone and he didn't answer his cell phone, I thought, this is getting a little weird. I just knew something was wrong.
A deputy is dispatched to meet Robin at Craig's house.
So when patrol met with Robin Drew, patrol ended up entering the house.
Craig?
They found that nobody was in the house.
We had an individual who had a very regular pattern of life. There was no suspicion of, him just up and leaving for no reason. But there was no sign of Craig at the house.
It's now 18 hours since Robin has heard from Craig.
Now things are starting to seem very suspicious and certainly made it believe that something bad could have happened. And at that point, Major Crimes was notified, and that's when I ended up responding to the scene.
Monroe County requests a warrant for a full house search.
So once I arrived, I spoke to the investigators that were already on scene. As we're waiting for the search warrant to be signed, we saw a vehicle pull up that contained Laura Rideout, a male, and a couple of children.
Craig's wife, you say?
I asked Laura a couple of questions. I asked, why she was there and what was going on. She said she had come over in the morning to pick up the kids. She then went to a doctor's appointment and then shopping, and she was bringing the kids back because it was time for them to come back.
Have you seen Craig at all lately?
No.
She told me she had no idea.
As part of any missing person investigation, one of the things we look to do is to find out if they had a cell phone with them.
Robin gave us his cell phone number.
I'm gonna get on with the phone company.
Yes.
The carrier always knows where that phone is roughly, just so that when a call comes in, they can make contact.
Yeah, I need a ping on a phone.
So in this case, the ping showed that the phone was in fact down in Yates County.
Our 911 dispatch center got a call Around 7:53 in the morning, a local farmer was riding his bicycle when he saw some blood stains in the dirt there, and he walked off into the brush. That's when he observed a brownish-colored tarp. We sent the patrol deputy who got there around, I'd say around 8 o'clock that morning. He could see some blood stains along the shoulder of the road. There appeared to be some tire tracks. The local farmer showed him in the brush where this tarp was rolled up. He knew right away we probably had a homicide.
They could tell it's a male. What it appeared to them was that someone had come down with the intention of burying this person, but something was done to try to disfigure this person, putting acid on them in order to make them less identifiable. Whatever substance was used to cause the disfigurement was so powerful that it ate through clothing, plastic buttons. It was quite a gruesome scene.
They also provided information about plastic seals from some type of a bottle top being found in the tarp with the victim. We were assuming at that point that we may have part of the bottles of whatever was poured on that victim. A straight-edge shovel was found.
And one could surmise logically that the intent was to bury this body in tarp, but it was not the kind of shovel that I would have wanted to use to dig a hole like that. Investigator Manahan and Investigator Butler were both leaning down, looking at this body, which they didn't want to disturb, while they were hovered over the body. Manahan, he looks at Butler and says, "Answer your phone, man." And Butler looks back at him and says, "Answer your phone." And they looked at each other, and the phone continued to ring. The phone is ringing from the body in the tarp.
First responders had called that phone in an attempt to contact Craig.
We always have to wait to make a proper positive identification. But I think at that point in the investigation, we knew what was going on, and we knew that our victim was no longer a missing person. Whoever did this didn't transport a live victim down there, so our assumption was that we would find the crime scene either at the victim's home or somewhere in our county.
Their victim's advocate approached me and said, "We're not sure. There has been a body found. He may have been a victim of serious foul play."
We told her, although we don't have any positive confirmation, it was very possible that the individual found there was potentially her brother.
The emotions that I was feeling were shock and anger, but I was still I kind of went numb. because I still wanted to be of assistance in getting the people who were responsible for doing this to him.
To start with, is there anything you can think of, anything at all?
But Robin knew that she needed to give us more detail, more information for our investigation. She really had to set aside an incredible amount of grief. It must have been very difficult for her.
I believe there was a camera in his clock on his computer desk.
Craig either had a hidden camera or a webcam that might have been running. And so when we entered the house as part of executing the search warrant, that was one of the first things we were looking for.
Craig set up the hidden camera for security.
Just into what would be the kitchen, there was a desk, and I noticed a small hidden camera that was disguised as a clock.
See if you can find a card or something.
And we were pretty excited. Where that table was, if you were coming anywhere through that house, you would have had to have passed that camera. Our digital forensics people are able to open it, and there's an SD card in it. Again, great excitement that we're gonna have this crime, we're gonna have everything we need captured right here on the tape.
As I watched video after video, I found video of just his young son sitting there working on a computer. I found a number of just day-to-day videos captured on it. And unfortunately, that memory card appears to have been filled up. It didn't overwrite itself, it just stopped recording. So I didn't have anything captured of the actual crime. After the letdown of the video, I joined the rest of the group that was still searching the house.
As we got to the basement stairs and looked down the basement stairs, we saw some cardboard boxes.
There was a partially empty Diet Coke bottle that was sitting on the floor. And I remember a black plastic garbage bag, and I kneeled down and tore the bag open, and it was there that I found paper towels that appeared to have been used to absorb blood.
You're gonna want to take a look at this.
As I looked through that bag, there was enough that was alarming me to say, this is absolutely our crime scene. The next bag I opened had a leather work glove that clearly looked like it had blood on it. And it also had a makeshift garrote. At this phase of it, we wanted to use what's referred to as an alternative light source that will allow them to see any blood that would be left over. And in this case, we had spatter on boxes, on the walls, on the floor, all over. We knew that this was a violent crime scene. Now, we absolutely knew not only did we have our scene, but we had very likely a murder weapon.
The body, believed to be Craig Rideout, was found 50 miles southeast of Craig's home.
Now, knowing that we had the murder scene in Monroe County, Yates County had the victim down in their county, we got cellular records from the victim's cell phone. The carrier captured a number of rough locations of where this phone was.
Due to that, we're able to kind of plot out the route that's taken from Craig's house down to Yates County. We then canvassed that entire route looking for any cameras that may have caught anything along the way.
We collected hundreds of hours of video. We've started to now review that video. We're looking for the vehicle that was used to transport him to his grave.
Detectives pull up footage from a hotel halfway to the makeshift burial site.
I was pretty certain they had traveled on this one road. We knew that that victim's phone had left his home shortly after 3 a.m., and traffic is very light at 3 a.m.
You're hoping to see license plates, distinguishing characteristics of the vehicle. If you're real lucky, maybe you get a shot of a driver. Anything we can see.
Pause it.
What that video showed was two vehicles traveling between here and the makeshift burial site.
Zoom in on that.
These cameras, they don't capture the license plates or those kind of identifying characteristics we're looking for. But Craig Rideout's phone is hitting the cell phone tower or speaking to the cell phone tower at the exact same time it's passing those cameras.
Is that a sedan with a van?
He had what we believe to be the victim's van traveling closely with another vehicle. And from the body, it looks like a sedan.
With almost no traffic on the road, detectives suspect these vehicles are traveling in convoy.
We're very confident that Craig is in one of those vehicles.
Check if they come back the same way. Go forward a couple hours.
Investigators view the same camera later that morning.
Now we see the same two vehicles returning, but now we're seeing them in daylight.
One clearly a minivan, and one clearly a sedan.
They scroll through more cameras on the same route.
We found 6 or 7 spots where video showed clearly two vehicles.
We started to find those two cars traveling always together, right behind one another, over and over again. Although we were able to capture the two vehicles traveling back towards Monroe County, we ultimately couldn't find where they went.
And we know that there's two vehicles involved at this point, which would obviously mean more than one person is involved in this murder.
The medical examiner confirms the body found in Yates County is Robin's brother, Craig Rideout.
We go to my mom's house. I call her, wake her up, say, we're coming in. I need to talk to you. And she obviously knew something was up. She was heartbroken. We comforted each other, and we still comfort each other. One of the things that my brother Craig did when he was given his divorce summons, he said, I am going to conduct myself with dignity and grace. We agreed that we would carry on his commitment of holding your head up high with dignity and grace. In private, I'm not always put together. I have my moments of, I'm gonna let it go. But in the same vein of honoring Craig, dignity and grace, not losing it for everybody to see.
Investigators processed the physical evidence found alongside Craig's body.
When Yates County did their crime scene investigation, they recovered a shovel. And on that shovel was a UPC code.
And it gave us a good starting point for us to start looking at where this product is sold. There were no other of that specific model shovels sold anywhere in our area inside of the week, with the exception of just one, and it happened to be the closest Walmart to our victim's house. Big retailers usually have good video that we can go back on.
They had sold a shovel sometime after midnight, about a day prior to the crime.
Do you mind if we take a look at your footage?
Can you start this at midnight?
I see a sedan pull up.
That car looks very similar to the car we had seen in our traffic cameras. The vehicle sits there for a minute.
Zoom in on that for me.
I ultimately see what I believe to be a male emerge from that car from the back seat and walk to the front door.
Do you have any other cameras?
Now I have a much better lit image. My excitement level jumps right up. This is going to be one of the most crazy cases that I've been a part of working on.
When we look at that male, we realize that that's Colin Rideout, that's Craig Rideout's son.
Did you follow him around the store?
We jump around trying to see what he's buying in the store, and we end up at the cash register. It's an overhead view looking down.
And at the register, we see him take from his cart and place on the conveyor that same shovel that we had seen down in Yates County. And then he puts 4 sets of work gloves on the conveyor belt as well. At that point, we know that Colin Rideout, for sure, is involved in this murder. And I believed if more people were involved in this murder.
As exciting of a lead it was to see Colin Rideout standing at that register, it still was a little perplexing because to think that the son could be involved in this, it was too hard to even believe. We watched him pay for those items and then exit the store. I had already seen the car out in the parking lot. I knew that Colin didn't get out of the driver's seat. Now we catch glimpses where you could see silhouettes in the car, but there weren't ever great views.
Go back to the entrance.
The entrance camera happened to look out from the doorway. This car pulls right up to the crosswalk, and now we have a much better image of the vehicle.
We see a driver, we see someone in the passenger side front seat, and someone in the rear driver's side seat.
We could very confidently say there were 3 other individuals in that car.
Can you clean up that image?
We try everything we can do to enhance the video, to do whatever we can to try and see who the 3 people are with Colin. Ultimately, we can't tell who the 3 people are. We just know that there's 3 people. We'd worked all night, and we were just to the point where we kind of thought we were going to go home for the day. But then we get a call, and we're alerted to our patrol had responded to a place called Devil's Bathtub. Well, a lady was up walking in the park. She saw 2 males carrying garbage bags from the trunk of their vehicle down to the pond and throwing those bags into the pond. When we get there, we see that the deputies have the 2 individuals separated. Myself and my partner, we walked up, introduced ourselves. It was clear that this was Colin Rideout and Alex Rideout. All the while, we were recording on covert iPhone. We were recording our conversation.
So what's going on? You and your brother out for a walk?
I mean, we were just like out, and then suddenly people show up, and it's like, well, I've never really encountered police before, so it was like,
how old are you?
I'm doing college next year.
And I started talking to him about his father, his relationship with his father, if he was nervous that he hadn't heard from his father.
He'd always threaten, oh, I could just disappear. And I figured he was on the next flight to Mexico.
Have you heard anything from your dad? Well, I emailed him last night. I didn't hear from him. I've been kind of worried about him for, stuff's just been freaking me out.
And at that time, the fire department had responded, and they were going to try and recover the bags from the pond. So I put my arm around Colin, and I said, Colin, they're going to bring those bags into the shore.
You tell me what's in that bag before I see what's in that bag. It'll be better for you.
I don't know what's in the bag.
At that point, we went back to the parking lot where we found Alex.
Alex, do you have any idea where your dad is?
Alex was not at all shy about the fact that he did not like his father, and it was quite obvious that Alex idolized Colin. At that point, Alex gets a little restless with us, and he decides he wants to end the conversation. What I did at that time is I directed the road patrol deputies to bring them to get some food, whatever fast food restaurant they want to go to, but make sure they get drinks. We were able to recover the straws from those drinks that we had purchased their lunch with, and we used those straws to get our DNA profiles. At this point, we've recovered the bag. In those garbage bags, we find 4 bottles of drain cleaner. The bottles of drain cleaner have those plastic pull-off tops found at the crime scene, but they also contain UPC codes, or ways to track the purchase of those, similar to the shovel.
We found clothing that was clearly bloody.
So we bring Alex and Colin to the interview rooms. Ultimately, they don't want to talk anymore at that point. We don't want to let them go. We have a lot of evidence to further analyze. So the decision is made that we're going to arrest them for tampering with physical evidence.
So what we find down at Devil's Bathtub, it gives us what we believe now to be 2 of the individuals that we saw or likely saw in that car. But I don't think the boys were the mastermind or the brains behind the operation. We had recovered what we believed to be the likely bottles of drain cleaner or acid, which had likely been poured on the victim. This gave us a new jump-off point to start looking at where those bottles had been purchased. And so we reached out to Walmart to see if they could tell us dates and times and locations of where such products had been purchased.
Did you sell drain cleaner?
One transaction that we went to look at was one that occurred on the 18th.
Can you bring me up footage from the 18th?
I'm able to focus on the actual purchase. I see the 2 bottles of drain cleaner set up on the belt, and then I see who I recognize as Colin Rideout making this purchase.
Can you follow him?
I see Colin walking out by himself with the items he just purchased. We went back to focus on the outside cameras. And then all of a sudden, I see someone that I recognize. A short distance behind Colin was his mother, Laura Rideout. That just added to our suspicion that we had more family members directly involved with this.
Take that back about 20 minutes.
I start watching all of the Walmart video chronologically from the time Colin would have first entered the store. Colin is entering the store with his mother, Laura. I can finally tie Laura to the actual purchase of that drain cleaner that we know was involved in this.
Investigators work to trace the purchase of the other items found at the scene.
So from the evidence down in Yates County, a large brown tarp recovered. And we were able to find that purchase being made at a Walmart on Hudson Avenue
On the 19th, we knew that a transaction had occurred around 9 p.m.
Walking in through the front doors, coming from the parking lot, we see Laura Rideout with another man. They appear to be two regular shoppers. And that male is Paul Tucci. We know Paul Tucci as being Laura's new companion.
Can you follow them around the store?
We see Laura and the male looking at these tarps, and they seem to be shopping. Is this one good? What about this? Just as you would shop for groceries.
You can see the tarp, which we believe to be the tarp found with the victim wrapped in it.
They check out, and they leave just like any other couple would leave with their purchases.
Police believe they now have all their suspects caught on camera. DNA tests are carried out on several of the items that were taken into evidence.
The clothes Colin Rideout is wearing when he purchased that shovel are clothes that we recover from bags being disposed of at Mendon Ponds Park. That blood belonged to Craig Rideout. Alex Rideout, we have his DNA on items of clothing that are located in the basement of the home. Laura Rideout, she's wearing pants that have blood spatter on them. DNA matches those to Craig Rideout. We have Laura Rideout's DNA on a Diet Coke that was found in the basement.
The t-shirt and shorts Paul Tucci wears at the store are never recovered.
Video footage really helped make this case. I mean, the video footage is what gives us the route of the car going south. It gives us the route of the car coming back north.
It certainly gives us, our suspects in this case, purchasing those items that we've recovered at the scenes.
Without the video, this case would have been near impossible to solve. All these pieces of evidence were brought together in a way to form a case to charge 4 individuals for the murder of Craig Rideout. So ultimately, the case goes to trial.
The 4 defendants appoint separate attorneys. Each claim their client has no motive for murder. Laura and Colin Rideout are found guilty of second-degree murder and receive life sentences. Alex Rideout is found guilty of tampering with evidence and is sentenced to 4 years. Paul Tucci is acquitted on all charges due to a lack of evidence.
When they came out and they found the 2 boys and the estranged wife guilty, that was a sense of justice.
Through their investigation, detectives develop a theory of how Craig died and why. Laura and Craig were going through a divorce and custody battle.
Laura Rideout wanted to move to North Carolina. Laura had to have figured out a way to get Craig out of the way so that they could move their family. The plan was sneak into Craig's house. They had a key to the house. They were going to try and lure Craig into the basement, take the garrote, choke him out, take him down to Yates County. They were going to bury him. They were going to come back. What they didn't count on was Craig Rideout was going to fight for his life. There was a lot of fighting. That caused a lot of blood. That cleanup is what causes this plot to fail.
Only those present know for sure who dealt the fatal blows.
I know that Craig's estranged wife, she didn't just kill my brother. She took away a son. She took away an uncle. She took away a father. And in so doing, took away a mother to her own children because she's behind bars for the rest of her life. The fact that two of Craig's own children were culpable in this crime is mind-blowing to me. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he wanted nothing more than his relationship with his youngest children and to rebuild the relationship with his older children. He held his head up high and he lived with dignity and grace, and that is how I want him.
On the night of December 24th, 1991, the air over Big Island carried the quiet warmth of a place far removed from the winter that gripped most of the mainland United States. Christmas Eve here did not arrive with snow or the weight of freezing winds. It came instead with darkness that settled gently over volcanic terrain, with long stretches of road where the only illumination came from distant houses or passing headlights, and with a silence that felt deeper the farther one moved away from the small clusters of light that marked human presence. It was a silence that could feel peaceful, even comforting, but it was also the kind that could conceal what lay beyond the reach of sight. In places like the Puna district, where the landscape spread out in uneven layers of lava fields, sparse vegetation, and narrow roads cutting through isolation, that silence took on a different quality. It was not simply the absence of noise, but the absence of witnesses, of interruption, of anything that might stand between a person and whatever might happen in that space. The roads were not crowded. The night did not belong to crowds or movement. It belonged to stillness, to long stretches of emptiness where time seemed to slow, where a single figure could move through the darkness unnoticed. Somewhere within that stillness, a young woman stepped onto a road to run. Dana Ireland was 23 years old, living far from the place where she had been born, part of a quiet migration of young people who came to Hawaii seeking something different, something freer than what they had left behind. That night, her decision was simple, almost ordinary. A run along a quiet road, a moment of movement in the calm of a holiday evening. There was nothing in that decision that suggested risk, nothing that indicated it would become the last ordinary choice she would make. The road she chose did not announce its danger. It did not look like the setting of violence. It looked like what it was, a remote stretch of pavement in a place where nature often overshadowed human presence. The darkness was not unusual. The quiet was expected. And yet, within that ordinary setting, something shifted. At some point along that road, the isolation that defined the landscape became a condition that allowed something else to happen, something sudden and irreversible. There were no witnesses to mark the moment when the ordinary became something else. No one to describe the first sign of trouble, no voice to record the sequence of events as they unfolded. What is known begins after the fact, after the violence had already taken place, after the silence had already absorbed whatever struggle occurred in that darkness. What is known is that Dana Ireland was attacked, that the attack was severe, and that she was left behind on that road in a condition that would soon draw the attention of the first person to pass by in the morning light. The discovery came not in the chaos of night, but in the quiet clarity of day. A passerby, moving along the same road that had been empty hours before, encountered something that did not belong in the ordinary rhythm of the place. A body, broken and still, lying where no one should be. The distance between the darkness of the night and the brightness of the morning did nothing to soften what had happened. If anything, it made it more stark, more undeniable. The isolation that had concealed the crime now framed its aftermath. Dana was still alive when she was found, but only barely. Her injuries were severe, the kind that suggested not a moment of violence, but a sustained and deliberate attack. She could not speak. She could not explain. Whatever had happened on that road existed beyond her ability to communicate it, locked away behind the damage inflicted upon her. In that moment, the possibility of understanding what had occurred began to narrow. The person who might have provided the clearest account was unable to do so. She was taken to a hospital where the focus shifted from discovery to survival. Doctors worked within the limits of what her condition allowed, confronting injuries that spoke to the brutality of the attack without revealing its details. A fractured skull, multiple wounds, a body pushed to the edge of what it could endure. The effort to save her life unfolded over the course of days, a quiet struggle against damage that could not be undone. Throughout that time, she never regained consciousness. There were no words, no final account, no explanation that could bridge the gap between what had happened and what could be understood. On January 2nd, 1992, Dana Ireland died. Her death marked the end of one part of the story, but it was also the beginning of something else, a shift from immediate tragedy to a longer, more complex narrative that would unfold over years and decades. The questions that surrounded her attack did not disappear with her passing. They intensified, taking on a different urgency, one that would drive an investigation seeking answers in a situation where the most direct source of information was no longer available. At first, the case appeared to be one that demanded swift resolution. A violent crime, a young victim, a community confronted with the reality that something deeply disturbing had occurred within its boundaries. There was pressure, both internal and external, to identify those responsible, to restore a sense of order, to provide answers that could transform uncertainty into certainty. The expectation was that the investigation would move forward, that evidence would be gathered, that a narrative would emerge to explain what had taken place on that road. But even in these early moments, there were elements that hinted at the difficulty of what lay ahead. The location of the attack, remote and sparsely populated, offered little in the way of immediate leads. The absence of witnesses meant that there was no direct account to guide the initial stages of the investigation. The severity of the crime suggested intention, but not identity. Each of these factors contributed to a situation in which the search for answers would depend heavily on interpretation, on the ability to piece together fragments into a coherent whole. The contrast between the setting and the crime added another layer of complexity. Hawaii, often perceived as a place of safety and beauty, did not align easily with the reality of what had occurred. This contrast created a tension that extended beyond the specifics of the case, influencing how it was perceived, how it was discussed, and how it would be remembered. It was not just a crime, but a disruption of expectation, a reminder that even in places defined by their tranquility, violence could emerge without warning. As the investigation began to take shape, the focus shifted from the immediate facts to the possibilities they suggested. Who had been on that road that night? What sequence of events had led to the attack? Why had Dana been left alive, rather than killed at the scene? Each question opened another, expanding the scope of the case, while also highlighting its uncertainties. The answers were not immediately visible, and the path toward them was not clearly defined. What followed would not be a straightforward progression from crime to resolution. Instead, it would become a case defined by its complications, by the ways in which the search for answers intersected with the limitations of evidence, the pressures of investigation, and the fallibility of the systems designed to deliver justice. The events of that night, hidden within the darkness of a remote road on the Big Island, would set in motion a chain of consequences that extended far beyond the initial act of violence. And in the center of it all remained a single, unchanging fact. A young woman had gone out for a run on Christmas Eve and never returned to the life she had been building. Everything that followed, every question, every answer, every mistake, would trace back to that moment, to that decision, to that stretch of road where the silence of the night concealed something that would take years to begin to understand, and even longer to confront in full. Before the violence, before the investigation, before the long and complicated search for answers, there was a life moving forward in quiet, ordinary ways. Dana Ireland was 23 years old, standing at a point in life where direction is still being shaped, where decisions are guided as much by hope as by certainty. She had come from Virginia, leaving behind the familiarity of one place in exchange for the promise of another. Like many who make that journey, she was not only seeking a change in geography, but a change in possibility, a chance to redefine what her life might become in a setting that felt open and expansive. Hawaii, and particularly Big Island, holds a specific kind of appeal for those searching for that sense of renewal. It is often imagined as a place where the boundaries of routine can be loosened, where the rhythm of life is dictated less by obligation and more by choice. The landscape itself seems to encourage that perception. Vast stretches of volcanic terrain meeting the ocean, areas where human presence feels secondary to the scale of the natural world. For someone like Dana, the move to Hawaii was not unusual. It was part of a pattern, a quiet migration of individuals drawn by the idea that distance can create opportunity. But the reality of life on the Big Island is more complex than the image suggests. While there are areas that reflect the vibrancy and accessibility often associated with Hawaii, there are also regions defined by isolation, by long distances between homes, by roads that stretch without interruption through terrain that can feel both beautiful and unforgiving. The Puna district, where Dana would eventually run on that December night, is one of those places. It is characterized by its remoteness, by a sense of separation from the more populated parts of the island. Houses are scattered, often hidden behind vegetation or set back from the road. Lighting is minimal, particularly at night. Movement is limited, and the presence of others cannot be assumed. This contrast between expectation and reality is an important part of understanding the context in which Dana lived. The idea of Hawaii as a safe, almost idyllic environment does not always account for the ways in which isolation can shape experience. In places where there are few people and limited infrastructure, the absence of immediate help becomes a factor. The same quiet that can feel peaceful during the day can take on a different meaning at night, when visibility decreases and the sense of distance becomes more pronounced. For Dana, however, this environment was not necessarily defined by danger. It was simply the setting of her daily life, the place where she worked, where she moved through her routines, where she made choices that felt natural within that context. There is no indication that the road she chose to run on was seen as particularly threatening, no suggestion that the decision to go out that night carried an expectation of risk. It was a decision shaped by familiarity, by the understanding of the environment as it had been experienced up to that point. At 23, Dana occupied a space between independence and vulnerability that is common at that stage of life. Independence, in the sense that she had chosen to relocate, to build a life in a new place, to navigate that environment on her own terms. Vulnerability, in the sense that those choices placed her in situations where the support structures of familiarity were less immediate, where the distance from family and long-established networks could become significant in moments of crisis. This combination is not unusual, but it is important, as it frames the conditions under which the events of December 24th would occur. The broader social context of the area also plays a role, though it is one defined more by absence than by presence. The roads in Puna are not heavily trafficked, especially at night. Encounters between people are less frequent, and the likelihood of someone witnessing an unexpected event is reduced. This does not mean that the area is inherently unsafe, but it does mean that when something does happen, the chances of immediate intervention are limited. The environment does not provide the same level of passive protection that might exist in more populated areas, where the presence of others can act as a deterrent or a source of assistance. In this sense, the setting becomes an active component of the story, not because it causes events to occur, but because it shapes how they unfold and how they are experienced. The isolation of the road, the lack of lighting, the distance between houses, all contribute to a situation where a person can move through the space without being seen, where an incident can take place without immediate detection. These factors do not determine what happens, but they influence the conditions under which it happens. Understanding Dana's life in this context does not change the outcome, but it provides a framework for understanding the circumstances. She was not acting outside the bounds of normal behavior for someone in her position. Going for a run, even at night, was not an extraordinary decision. It was part of a routine, a way of engaging with the environment, of maintaining a sense of normalcy in a place that, despite its differences from where she had come from, had become her home. There is a tendency, in looking back at cases like this, to search for moments where a different decision might have altered the outcome, to identify points at which the path could have diverged. But this perspective can obscure the reality that the decisions made were not unusual, not inherently risky within the context in which they occurred. Dana's choice to go running that night was not a deviation from normal behavior, but an expression of it. It was a reflection of the life she was living, not a departure from it. As the narrative moves forward, from background to incident, it is important to carry this understanding with it. The events that followed did not arise from extraordinary circumstances, but from ordinary ones, from a decision that could have been made on any other night without consequence. This is part of what gives the case its enduring impact, the recognition that the boundary between safety and danger is not always clearly marked, that it can shift without warning, transforming a familiar environment into something else entirely. In the quiet of the Big Island, in the scattered lights of the Pune district, Dana Ireland's life unfolded in ways that were both typical and unique, shaped by the choices she made and the environment in which she made them. That life, defined by movement, by change, by the search for something new, would intersect with a moment that altered its course completely. And in understanding who she was, where she was, and why she was there, the foundation is laid for understanding what followed, not as an isolated event, but as something that emerged from the intersection of person, place, and circumstance, a convergence that would have consequences far beyond that single night. On the night of December 24th, 1991, the transition from evening to darkness came quietly over Big Island, as it often does in places where artificial light does not dominate the landscape. In the Pune district, where houses are scattered and roads stretch through long, uninterrupted distances, night does not simply fall, it settles, gradually removing detail from the environment until only outlines remain. The road where Dana Ireland chose to run was one of many like it, narrow, lightly traveled, bordered by vegetation and terrain shaped by the island's volcanic past. There were no crowds, no steady flow of traffic, no expectation that someone would be watching or even passing by. Dana stepped into that darkness as part of a routine that, until that moment, had been uneventful. Running was an ordinary act, a movement through space that required little more than time and intention. The road offered both an open path, a quiet setting, a place where the rhythm of footsteps could exist without interruption. There was nothing to indicate that this particular night would be different from any other, nothing to suggest that the environment she moved through would shift in meaning. At some point along that road, the continuity of that movement was broken. The exact moment cannot be fixed, the sequence of events cannot be reconstructed with certainty, but what is known is that Dana was attacked. The violence was not brief or incidental. It was severe, deliberate, and sustained, leaving her with injuries that spoke to the intensity of what had occurred. She was beaten, her body subjected to force that resulted in significant trauma. She was sexually assaulted, an act that compounded the physical violence with a violation that would later define the nature of the crime. And when the attack was over, she was not taken from the scene, not hidden or concealed in a way that would delay discovery. Instead, she was left where it had happened, on the side of the road, in a condition that suggested the attack had ended not because it was interrupted, but because it had reached a point where no further action was deemed necessary by the person who committed it. The decision to leave her there is one of the defining aspects of the case, though its meaning is not fully clear. It suggests a calculation, a choice made in the aftermath of violence, but without additional information, that choice cannot be fully understood. What it did create was a situation in which the possibility of survival remained, however limited. Dana was still alive when the attack ended, her body bearing the full extent of the injuries inflicted upon it, her consciousness either gone or beyond reach, but her life not yet extinguished. The hours that followed were marked by absence, the same absence that had defined the environment before the attack. The road remained quiet. The darkness continued uninterrupted. There were no witnesses to observe what had happened, no immediate response to alter the course of events. The space in which the attack occurred returned to stillness, holding within it the evidence of what had taken place, but offering no immediate path to understanding. Morning brought a change in light, but not in the fundamental nature of the scene. When Dana was found, it was not as part of an active search, but through the ordinary movement of someone traveling along the same road. The discovery was unexpected, a sudden confrontation with something that did not belong in the routine of that place. A human body, severely injured, lying in a position that indicated something had gone terribly wrong. The passerby who found her did not witness the attack, did not see the events that led to that moment, but became the first link between what had happened in the night and the response that would follow. Dana's condition at the time of discovery was critical. The injuries she had sustained were immediately apparent, their severity leaving little doubt about the nature of what had occurred. She was alive, but only barely, her body functioning at the edge of its capacity to sustain itself. There was no communication, no ability to describe what had happened, no way to identify the person responsible. The only information available was what could be observed, the physical evidence present at the scene, and the condition of the victim herself. She was transported to a hospital, where the focus shifted from discovery to medical intervention. The injuries she had sustained required immediate attention, but they also presented limitations. A fractured skull indicated significant trauma to the head, a level of force that had compromised her ability to regain consciousness. Additional wounds across her body reflected the extent of the assault, each one a piece of evidence, but none of them capable of explaining the sequence of events on their own. The medical response was an attempt to stabilize, to preserve life, but it was also constrained by the reality of the damage that had already been done. Throughout the days that followed, Dana remained unconscious. There was no moment of recovery, no brief return to awareness that might have allowed her to provide information. The absence of her voice became one of the central challenges of the case. In many investigations, the victim's account can serve as a primary source of information, guiding the direction of inquiry, identifying suspects, clarifying timelines. In this case, that source was unavailable. The narrative would have to be constructed without it, relying instead on external evidence and interpretation. On January 2, 1992, Dana Ireland died from her injuries. Her death marked the end of the immediate medical effort to save her life, but it also marked a transition in the case. What had been an attempted murder became a homicide, shifting the legal and investigative framework. The focus was no longer on survival, but on accountability, on identifying the person or persons responsible for what had occurred and bringing them into a system designed to address such acts. The brutality of the attack, combined with the absence of witnesses and the inability of the victim to provide an account, created a situation that demanded investigation but offered limited guidance on how that investigation should proceed. The scene itself, while containing evidence, did not present a clear narrative. The road remained as it had been, a stretch of pavement through a remote area, now marked by what had happened, but not transformed in a way that would make its secrets immediately accessible. The events of that night, and the hours that followed, form the core of the case. They are the fixed points around which everything else revolves, the elements that cannot be changed or reinterpreted. Dana Ireland went out for a run on a quiet road on Christmas Eve. She was attacked with extreme violence. She was found alive but critically injured, and she died days later, without regaining consciousness. These facts define the incident, establishing the parameters within which all subsequent investigation and analysis must operate. What remains unknown, and what would continue to shape the case, is everything that exists between those points. The identity of the attacker, the precise sequence of events, the motivations behind the violence, all remain outside the scope of what can be directly observed. They exist as questions, as gaps in the narrative that cannot be filled without additional information. And it is within those gaps that the complexity of the case begins to emerge, transforming a series of events into a mystery that would take years to fully confront, and even longer to begin to understand. In the immediate aftermath of the attack on Dana Ireland, the focus shifted rapidly from shock to action, from the stark reality of what had happened on a quiet road in the Pune district to the urgent need to understand who was responsible. The severity of the crime, combined with the fact that it had taken place in a relatively isolated part of Big Island, created both pressure and urgency. There was an expectation from within the community and from the institutions responsible for investigating such crimes that answers would be found, that the person or persons who had committed such a violent act would be identified and brought to justice. The investigation began with the tools available at the time. Law enforcement collected evidence from the scene, including biological material that would later become central to the case. DNA analysis existed, but it was not yet as advanced or as widely relied upon as it would become in later years. At that stage, it was one component among many, a potential source of information, but not necessarily the defining one. Investigators also began interviewing individuals within the surrounding area, seeking any information that might help reconstruct the events of that night. Given the remoteness of the location, this process was inherently challenging. There were few people who might have seen or heard anything, and the absence of witnesses meant that the investigation would have to rely heavily on indirect evidence and the statements of those who came under suspicion. As the investigation progressed, attention turned toward a group of local men who would eventually become the central figures in the case. Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline were identified, questioned, and ultimately arrested in connection with the attack. The reasons for their selection were rooted in the investigative process, in the information that was gathered, interpreted, and shaped into a narrative that linked them to the crime. At this stage, that narrative began to take form, providing a framework through which the events could be understood, or at least explained. Central to this emerging narrative were statements and confessions obtained during interrogations. These statements, however, were not consistent. There were discrepancies, changes in detail, elements that did not align perfectly with one another. Some aspects of the confessions raised concerns, particularly regarding the conditions under which they were obtained. Questions emerged about whether the statements had been influenced by the interrogation process itself, whether pressure had been applied, whether the individuals involved had provided information that was shaped by external factors rather than direct experience. Despite these inconsistencies, the confessions played a significant role in shaping the direction of the investigation. In the absence of clear, definitive physical evidence that could independently establish the sequence of events, these statements became a primary source of information. They provided a narrative that could be followed, a version of events that could be presented as an explanation for what had happened on that road. Once established, this narrative began to guide further investigative efforts, influencing how evidence was interpreted and how additional information was evaluated. At the same time, the forensic evidence collected at the scene existed in a more ambiguous space. DNA samples had been obtained, but the technology available at the time limited the extent to which those samples could be analyzed and compared. The presence of biological material suggested the involvement of an individual, but it did not, at that stage, conclusively link that material to the men who had been arrested. This gap between the potential of forensic evidence and its practical application created a situation in which the investigation relied more heavily on the statements obtained during interrogations. As the case continued to develop, the initial uncertainties began to solidify into a more fixed interpretation. Investigators, working within the pressures of the situation, moved toward a conclusion that identified the three men as responsible for the crime. This conclusion was not reached in isolation, but through a process that combined available evidence, witness statements, and the confessions that had been obtained. Over time, the narrative became more defined, less open to alternative interpretations, and more aligned with the idea that the case had been effectively solved. However, within this process, certain elements remained unresolved. The inconsistencies in the confessions did not disappear. The limitations of the forensic evidence did not change. These factors existed alongside the developing narrative, not fully integrated into it, but not entirely dismissed either. They represented points of tension within the case, areas where the available information did not fully align with the conclusions being drawn. The investigative process, in this context, can be understood as both thorough and constrained. Thorough in the sense that efforts were made to gather information, to identify suspects, to construct a narrative that explained the crime. Constrained in the sense that the conditions under which the investigation took place, including the limitations of available technology and the absence of direct witnesses, shaped the outcomes that could be achieved. These constraints did not halt the investigation, but they influenced its direction, guiding it towards certain conclusions while leaving other possibilities less explored. As the case moved closer to prosecution, the narrative that had been constructed during the investigation became the foundation upon which the legal process would be built. The confessions, despite their inconsistencies, were positioned as key pieces of evidence. The forensic material, while not definitive, remained part of the overall case. Together, these elements formed the basis for the charges that would be brought against the three men. At this stage, the case appeared to have reached a point of resolution. Suspects had been identified, arrested, and charged. A narrative had been established that explained the events in a way that aligned with the available evidence, or at least with the interpretation of that evidence. From an external perspective, the process seemed to be moving toward a conclusion, one in which accountability would be assigned and the questions surrounding the crime would be answered. Yet beneath this appearance of resolution, the underlying uncertainties remained. The inconsistencies in the statements, the limitations of the forensic evidence, the absence of a clear, independent reconstruction of events, all persisted as elements that had not been fully resolved. They did not prevent the case from moving forward, but they introduced a level of complexity that would later become significant. In the broader context of the case, this phase of the investigation represents a critical turning point. It is the moment at which uncertainty begins to give way to interpretation, at which possibilities are narrowed into a single, dominant narrative. It is also the moment at which the consequences of that narrative begin to take shape, influencing not only the direction of the case, but the lives of those involved. The investigation into the attack on Dana, Ireland was driven by the need for answers, by the urgency of a crime that demanded explanation. It was conducted within the constraints of its time, using the tools and methods available. It produced a narrative that would carry the case forward into the courtroom. But within that narrative, the unresolved elements remained, quiet but persistent, waiting for a future in which they would be revisited, re-examined, and understood in a different light. As the case moved from investigation into the courtroom, the narrative that had been constructed around the attack on Dana, Ireland was presented as a coherent explanation of what had taken place on that remote road in the Pune district. The transition from inquiry to prosecution brought with it a shift in focus. The questions that had driven the investigation were now reframed as assertions, the uncertainties shaped into arguments that would be tested within the structure of a legal proceeding. The courtroom became the space where those arguments would be evaluated, where the story of the crime would be told not as a series of possibilities, but as a sequence of events intended to establish responsibility. At the center of this process were the three men who had been identified during the investigation: Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline. They entered the courtroom not as individuals under suspicion, but as defendants facing serious charges, their roles within the narrative defined by the conclusions reached during the investigative phase. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the statements that had been obtained during interrogations, presenting them as confessions that linked the defendants directly to the crime. These confessions formed the backbone of the prosecution's argument. They provided a version of events that could be described in detail, a narrative that transformed the unknown into something that appeared knowable. Yet the same characteristics that had raised concerns during the investigation remained present in the courtroom. The statements were not entirely consistent, their details shifting in ways that introduced questions about their reliability. The defense focused on these inconsistencies, highlighting the differences between the accounts, pointing to the possibility that the confessions had not been given freely or accurately. The issue of how these statements were obtained became a central point of tension within the trial. The defense raised concerns about the conditions of the interrogations, suggesting that pressure may have influenced what was said. They argued that the confessions could not be taken at face value, that they required careful scrutiny rather than acceptance. This line of argument introduced doubt, challenging the prosecution's reliance on the statements as definitive evidence. Alongside the confessions, the forensic evidence was presented, though its role within the trial was more complex. DNA had been collected from the scene, but the limitations of the technology at the time meant that its significance was not as clear or as decisive as it might have been in a later context. It existed as part of the evidentiary landscape, but it did not provide a direct, unambiguous link between the defendants and the crime. This gap placed additional weight on the confessions, reinforcing their importance within the overall case. The defense emphasized this point, arguing that the lack of strong forensic evidence should be considered alongside the inconsistencies in the statements. They presented the case as one in which the available evidence did not fully support the conclusions being drawn, where the narrative constructed by the prosecution relied too heavily on elements that were themselves uncertain. The courtroom became a space where these competing interpretations were presented, each side seeking to establish a version of events that would be accepted as the truth. Despite these challenges, the prosecution maintained its position, presenting the case as a coherent and compelling account of what had occurred. The severity of the crime, the presence of confessions, and the overall structure of the narrative combined to create a powerful argument. Within the context of the trial, this argument carried weight, shaping how the evidence was perceived and how the case was understood. The outcome reflected this dynamic. The court reached a verdict that found the defendants guilty. Albert Ian Schweitzer and Sean Schweitzer received life sentences, a reflection of the seriousness of the charges and the gravity of the crime. Frank Pauline received a lesser sentence, but was nonetheless held accountable within the framework established by the trial. With these verdicts, the case appeared to reach a conclusion. The individuals identified as responsible had been tried, convicted, and sentenced. From a procedural perspective, the process had worked as intended, moving from investigation to prosecution to resolution. The narrative constructed during the investigation had been accepted within the courtroom, its elements validated through the legal process. For the broader community, this outcome provided a sense of closure. The questions that had emerged in the aftermath of the attack were, at least in part, answered. The uncertainty that had defined the early stages of the case was replaced by a definitive conclusion, one that identified those responsible and established a clear account of what had happened. The case, in this sense, was considered resolved, its place within the system of justice defined and completed. Yet even at this point, the underlying complexities of the case did not disappear. The concerns raised during the trial, the inconsistencies in the confessions, the limitations of the forensic evidence, all remained part of the record. They did not prevent the verdict from being reached, but they persisted as elements that had not been fully reconciled. These elements did not immediately alter the outcome, but they remained present, part of the case's structure, available to be revisited at a later time. The legal resolution of the case, therefore, existed alongside these unresolved aspects, creating a situation in which the appearance of closure did not entirely align with the underlying details. This tension was not immediately apparent, as the focus shifted away from the case following the verdicts. The narrative had been accepted, the process had been completed, and the attention that had once been concentrated on the investigation began to dissipate. For the individuals involved, however, the consequences of the verdicts were immediate and lasting. The sentences imposed by the court defined their futures, shaping their lives in ways that extended far beyond the courtroom. The case, while considered closed in a legal sense, continued to exist in the lived experiences of those who had been convicted, as well as in the memory of the crime itself. In this phase of the story, the case of Dana Ireland transitioned from an active investigation to a concluded matter, its outcome recorded, its narrative established. But within that conclusion, the elements that had raised questions remained, quiet and unresolved, forming a foundation upon which future developments would eventually build. At the time, however, those developments were not yet visible, and the case stood as an example of a crime investigated, prosecuted, and resolved within the framework of the justice system, its deeper complexities waiting beneath the surface, not yet fully understood. In the years that followed the convictions in the case of Dana Ireland, the narrative appeared settled, fixed within the framework established by the investigation and affirmed by the courtroom. The three men found guilty, Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline, began serving their sentences, their roles in the case defined by the verdict that had been delivered. For a time, the case receded from public focus, its conclusion accepted, its place within the system of justice considered complete. Yet beneath that surface of finality, questions persisted. They did not immediately disrupt the established narrative, but they remained present, carried forward by those who continued to examine the details of the case. Over time, these questions began to gain more attention, driven in part by evolving perspectives on investigative practices and in part by advances in forensic science that offered new ways of examining old evidence. The passage of time, rather than closing the case entirely, created the conditions under which it could be revisited. Central to this renewed attention was the issue of the confessions that had played such a significant role in the original trial. Concerns about their reliability, about the conditions under which they had been obtained, and about the inconsistencies within them did not disappear after the verdict. Instead, they became focal points for those who sought to re-examine the case. Legal advocates and organizations began to question whether the conclusions reached in the early 1990s were fully supported by the available evidence, or whether the process had been influenced by factors that had not been adequately addressed at the time. At the same time, developments in DNA analysis began to reshape the landscape of criminal investigation. Techniques that had once been limited became more precise, more capable of producing definitive results from biological material. The evidence collected from the scene of the attack on Dana, Ireland, which had existed in a more ambiguous state during the original investigation, could now be subjected to more advanced testing. This shift introduced the possibility that the forensic evidence might provide answers that had not been accessible before. When the DNA evidence was re-examined using modern methods, the results were both significant and unexpected. The biological material collected at the scene did not match the profiles of the 3 men who had been convicted. This finding challenged the foundation of the original case, raising immediate and profound questions about the accuracy of the verdicts. If the DNA did not link the defendants to the crime, then the narrative that had been constructed around their involvement required reevaluation. The analysis did not stop at exclusion. The DNA profile was compared against other potential sources, and a match was identified. The biological evidence pointed to James Dennis Schweitzer, an individual who had not been the focus of the original prosecution in the same way as the 3 convicted men. This discovery introduced a new dimension to the case, shifting the focus from those who had been held responsible to a different individual whose connection to the crime had not been previously established in a definitive way. The implications of this finding were immediate and far-reaching. The convictions of Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline could no longer be considered secure. The evidence that had once supported the case against them was now contradicted by forensic results that carried a high degree of reliability. The legal system, which had previously concluded the case, was now required to revisit it, to reassess the outcomes that had been reached. As the process of reevaluation unfolded, the focus shifted from establishing guilt to addressing the possibility of wrongful conviction. The same case that had once been presented as a successful resolution of a violent crime was now examined as an example of how errors can occur within the system. The confessions that had been central to the prosecution were re-examined in light of the DNA evidence, their inconsistencies taking on new significance. What had once been interpreted as corroboration now appeared as a point of concern, raising questions about how those statements had been obtained and how they had been used. The legal consequences of this shift were substantial. The convictions began to be overturned or reduced, and the individuals who had spent years, in some cases decades, in prison were released. Albert Ian Schweitzer was freed after more than 20 years of incarceration, his life profoundly shaped by a conviction that was no longer supported by the evidence. Sean Schweitzer was also exonerated, his case reevaluated in light of the new findings. Frank Pauline, whose sentence had been different from the others, was likewise released following a reassessment of his involvement. These developments transformed the case from one of resolution to one of reconsideration. The focus was no longer solely on the crime itself, but on the processes that had led to the original convictions. Questions about investigative methods, about the reliance on confessions, and about the interpretation of evidence became central to understanding how the case had unfolded. The narrative that had once provided closure was replaced by a more complex and unsettling account, one that acknowledged the possibility of error within a system designed to deliver justice. At the same time, The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer as the source of the DNA evidence raised its own set of challenges. While the forensic findings pointed to his involvement, the opportunity to pursue legal action was no longer available. He had died before charges could be brought, placing him beyond the reach of the judicial process. This development introduced a final layer of complexity, as the person identified by the evidence could not be tried or convicted in a court of law. The outcome of this sequence of events is one defined by partial resolution. The wrongful convictions were addressed, the individuals affected were released, and the forensic evidence provided a clearer understanding of who was responsible for the crime. Yet the absence of a trial for the individual identified by the DNA means that the case does not conclude in the traditional sense. There is no final verdict that establishes guilt within the courtroom, no formal conclusion that brings the legal process to a definitive end. In reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that its significance extends beyond the specifics of the crime itself. It serves as an example of how the pursuit of justice can be influenced by the limitations of available evidence, by the pressures of investigation, and by the interpretations that shape the understanding of events. It also demonstrates the importance of revisiting cases as new tools and methods become available, recognizing that conclusions reached in one context may need to be reevaluated in another. The story of Dana Ireland remains at the center of this reflection. Her life, interrupted by violence, is the reason the case exists at all. The developments that followed, the convictions, the reevaluations, the exonerations, all trace back to that initial event, to the moment when her life was taken. The passage of time has brought greater clarity to some aspects of the case, but it has not changed its fundamental reality. In the end, the case stands as both a resolution and a warning. A resolution in the sense that the wrongful convictions were corrected and the evidence identified a likely perpetrator. A warning in the sense that the path to that resolution was long and marked by error, demonstrating how easily the search for answers can lead to conclusions that later require reconsideration. It is a case that does not settle into a simple narrative, but remains layered, complex, and instructive, carrying with it the weight of both what was done and what was undone over the course of its history. In the years after the case of Dana Ireland was reopened and re-examined, what emerged was not simply a corrected record, but a deeper understanding of how a narrative can take shape, solidify, and persist even when it is built on uncertain ground. The shift from conviction to exoneration did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, shaped by the accumulation of doubt, the advancement of forensic science, and the willingness of individuals and institutions to revisit conclusions that had once been considered final. At the center of this transformation was the recognition that the original investigation had relied heavily on confessions that were not as stable as they had appeared. The statements given by Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline had been treated as anchors for the narrative, points around which other pieces of evidence were arranged. But when the DNA evidence was revisited and found to contradict their involvement, those statements were reinterpreted, no longer as confirmations of guilt, but as potential examples of how investigative pressure and circumstance can influence what individuals say. This reinterpretation did not erase what had happened during the original investigation, but it reframed it. The same details that had once supported a conclusion now raised questions about the process that had produced them. The inconsistencies within the confessions, previously seen as minor variations within a broader truth, became significant indicators that something was not aligned. The absence of strong forensic support, once overshadowed by the weight of the statements, became central to understanding how the case had been constructed. As the legal system responded to these developments, the process of exoneration brought its own complexities. The release of the three men marked a formal acknowledgement that the convictions could not stand in light of the new evidence. For Albert Ian Schweitzer, who had spent more than 2 decades in prison, this moment represented a profound shift, from a life defined by incarceration to one marked by the need to rebuild. Sean Schweitzer and Frank Pauline faced similar transitions, each navigating the consequences of years spent under a conviction that had now been overturned or reduced. These releases did not simply close a chapter, they opened a new one focused on the broader implications of what had occurred. The case became an example of wrongful conviction, illustrating how the combination of investigative pressure, reliance on questionable statements, and limitations in forensic analysis can lead to outcomes that later require correction. It also highlighted the role of evolving technology in uncovering those errors, demonstrating how advances in DNA testing can provide clarity where uncertainty once existed. At the same time, the identification of James Dennis Schweitzer as the source of the DNA evidence introduced a different kind of complexity. The forensic findings pointed toward his involvement in the attack, providing a level of specificity that had been absent in the original case. Yet this identification did not lead to a trial or a conviction. His death before charges could be brought placed him beyond the reach of the legal system, creating a situation in which the evidence suggested responsibility, but the process of formal accountability could not be completed. This outcome created a dual reality within the case. On one hand, there was a clear understanding of who had committed the crime, based on forensic evidence that carried a high degree of reliability. On the other hand, there was an absence of formal resolution, no courtroom verdict that could definitively establish guilt within the framework of the justice system. The case, in this sense, remained partially open, its central question addressed in one way, but unresolved in another. The impact of this duality extends beyond the specifics of the case. It raises questions about what constitutes justice, about whether the identification of a likely perpetrator is sufficient in the absence of a trial, about how to reconcile the correction of wrongful convictions with the inability to fully prosecute the individual responsible. These questions do not have simple answers, but they form an important part of the case's legacy, shaping how it is understood and discussed. For the community in which the crime occurred, the developments in the case represented a significant shift. The narrative that had once provided closure was replaced by one that acknowledged error and uncertainty. This shift required a reevaluation of assumptions, a recognition that the conclusions previously accepted were not fully supported by the evidence. It also introduced a sense of unease, as the realization that the wrong individuals had been held accountable raised broader concerns about the reliability of the system. The case also became part of a larger conversation about the role of forensic science in criminal investigations. The contrast between the limitations of DNA analysis in the early 1990s and its capabilities in later years highlighted the importance of technological advancement. It demonstrated how evidence that could not be fully interpreted at one time could later provide critical insights, altering the course of a case and challenging previously established conclusions. At its core, however, the case remains anchored in the events of December 24, 1991, and the loss of Dana Ireland. The developments that followed, the convictions, the exonerations, the identification of a different suspect, all stem from that initial act of violence. While the later stages of the case focus on the processes of justice and correction, they do not change the fact that a life was taken in a brutal and irreversible way. As the narrative continues to evolve, it carries with it both resolution and incompleteness. The wrongful convictions have been addressed, the forensic evidence has provided new clarity, and the case has been redefined in ways that acknowledge past errors. Yet the absence of a trial for the individual identified by the DNA means that the legal process does not reach a definitive conclusion. The case exists in a space between understanding and closure, where some questions have been answered and others remain beyond reach. In this space, the story of Dana Ireland becomes more than a single event. It becomes a reflection of how cases can change over time, how the pursuit of justice can be both flawed and self-correcting, how the introduction of new evidence can reshape what was once considered certain. It is a story that does not follow a simple path from crime to resolution, but one that moves through stages of understanding, each revealing new dimensions of what occurred and how it was interpreted. And in that movement, the case continues to hold significance, not only for what it reveals about the events of that night, but for what it shows about the processes that seek to explain them. It remains a reminder that the search for truth is not always linear, that it can involve missteps and corrections, and that even when clarity is achieved, it may come in a form that does not fully resolve the questions that began it. As time moved further away from the night of December 24, 1991, The case of Dana, Ireland settled into a place that few cases ever fully reach, a space defined not by a single, clean resolution, but by layers of understanding that exist alongside one another. The events themselves remained unchanged, fixed in their brutality and finality, but the meaning of those events, the way they were interpreted and remembered, continued to evolve. What had once been considered a closed case became something more complex, a reflection of both the crime and the system that attempted to respond to it. For those who had been wrongfully convicted, the passage of time carried a weight that could not be undone. Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline had each lived through years defined by a narrative that had now been overturned. Their release marked a legal correction, an acknowledgement that the evidence used to convict them did not withstand later scrutiny, but it did not erase the time they had lost. The years spent in prison remained part of their lives, shaping their experiences in ways that extended beyond the moment of exoneration. The concept of justice in this context becomes difficult to define. On one level, there was a clear effort to correct a mistake, to address the wrongful convictions and restore freedom to those who had been unjustly imprisoned. On another level, the delay in reaching that correction introduced a different kind of harm, one that could not be fully repaired. The system that had ultimately reversed its conclusions had also been responsible for establishing them in the first place, creating a situation in which both the error and its correction existed within the same framework. At the same time, the identification of James Dennis Schweitzer through DNA evidence provided a form of clarity that had been absent for decades. The forensic results offered a direct connection between an individual and the crime, something that had not been achieved during the original investigation. This clarity, however, was limited by circumstance. His death before prosecution meant that the legal process could not move forward, leaving the case without the formal conclusion that a trial might have provided. This absence of a trial creates a gap between knowledge and accountability. The evidence points in a specific direction, suggesting a resolution to the question of who committed the crime, but the lack of a judicial process means that this resolution exists outside the formal structures of the legal system. There is no verdict, no sentence, no official declaration of guilt within a courtroom. Instead, there is an understanding shaped by forensic evidence, accepted by those who have examined it, but not codified in the way that legal conclusions typically are. For the broader community, this outcome carries its own implications. The case, once seen as resolved, was later revealed to be more complicated, its original conclusions no longer fully supported. This shift requires a reevaluation of how such cases are understood, not only in terms of the specific details, but in terms of the processes that produce those details. It raises questions about how investigations are conducted, how evidence is interpreted, and how conclusions are reached, particularly in situations where pressure exists to provide answers quickly. The role of DNA evidence in this transformation is particularly significant. It demonstrates how advancements in technology can alter the trajectory of a case, providing insights that were previously unavailable. At the same time, it highlights the limitations of earlier methods, showing how reliance on less definitive forms of evidence can lead to conclusions that later require revision. This contrast underscores the importance of continuous evaluation within the justice system, the need to revisit cases when new tools and methods become available. Yet, even with these advancements, the case does not resolve into a simple narrative. The identification of a likely perpetrator does not fully close the story, just as the correction of wrongful convictions does not fully restore what was lost. Instead, the case remains layered, its different elements coexisting in a way that reflects both progress and limitation. It is a story of a crime, but also of an investigation, a trial, an error, and a correction, each part contributing to the overall understanding. At its center remains Dana, Ireland, whose life was taken in a moment of violence that cannot be undone. The developments that followed, the years of investigation, the courtroom proceedings, the later reevaluations, all stem from that single event. While the later stages of the case focus on questions of justice and error, they do not change the fundamental reality of what happened to her. The narrative may evolve, but the loss at its core remains constant. In reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that its significance extends beyond its individual components. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is not always straightforward, that it can involve misinterpretation as well as discovery, that it can require correction as well as resolution. It also illustrates the importance of maintaining a willingness to question established conclusions, to recognize that certainty at one point in time may not hold under later scrutiny. The passage of time, rather than diminishing the case, has added to its complexity. Each stage, from the initial investigation to the later exonerations, contributes to a broader understanding of how such cases unfold. This accumulation of perspective allows for a more nuanced view, one that acknowledges both the efforts made to address the crime and the ways in which those efforts fell short. Ultimately, the case exists as both a specific event and a broader lesson. It is the story of a young woman who went out for a run and never returned, a story of violence that shattered a life and reverberated through a community. It is also the story of how that violence was interpreted, how conclusions were drawn, and how those conclusions were later revisited. It is a reminder that the search for truth can be complicated, that it can involve both certainty and doubt, and that even when clarity is achieved, it may come in a form that does not fully resolve the questions that began it. In this way, the case of Dana Ireland continues to resonate, not only as a record of what happened, but as an ongoing reflection on how such events are understood. It does not offer a simple ending, but rather a layered conclusion, one that acknowledges both what has been learned and what remains beyond reach. And in that layered conclusion, it leaves behind a legacy that is as much about the process of seeking justice as it is about the crime itself, a reminder that understanding is often built over time, shaped by both the answers that are found and the questions that remain. In the long arc of time that follows a case like that of Dana Ireland, what remains is not only the record of events, but the imprint those events leave on the systems and people that encounter them. The crime itself, confined to a single night on a remote road in the Puna district of Big Island, becomes something larger when viewed through the years that follow, shaped by investigation, judgment, correction, and reflection. It is no longer only about what happened, but about how what happened was understood, how that understanding changed, and what those changes reveal. The case, in its later stages, becomes inseparable from the concept of error. Not error in the sense of a simple mistake, but in the more complex sense of a process that moved forward with incomplete or misinterpreted information, arriving at conclusions that would later be challenged. The wrongful convictions of Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline illustrate how such errors can take shape, how they can be reinforced by the structures designed to prevent them, and how difficult they can be to correct once they are established. What makes this case particularly striking is not only that an error occurred, but that it persisted for years. The initial investigation, the trial, the convictions, all contributed to a narrative that was accepted and maintained over time. That narrative was not static. It was reinforced through repetition, through the authority of legal decisions, through the absence of contradictory evidence that could definitively challenge it. In this way, the case demonstrates how a conclusion, once reached, can become embedded, shaping perception even in the presence of unresolved questions. The eventual reevaluation of the case, driven by advances in DNA analysis, represents a turning point not only in the specific circumstances of this investigation, but in the broader understanding of how such cases can be revisited. The ability to extract and analyze genetic material with greater precision allowed for a form of clarity that had not been available at the time of the original trial. When that clarity contradicted the established narrative, it forced a reconsideration that extended beyond the individual case, raising questions about how many other cases might be affected by similar limitations in earlier investigative methods. The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer as the source of the DNA evidence adds another dimension to this reflection. It provides a focal point for understanding the crime itself, offering a likely answer to the question of who is responsible. At the same time, it highlights the limitations of that answer, given that he could not be brought to trial. This duality, clarity without formal accountability, becomes a defining feature of the case's later stages, shaping how it is interpreted and discussed. For those who were wrongfully convicted, The process of exoneration represents both an end and a beginning. The legal acknowledgement that their convictions were not supported by the evidence brings a form of resolution, but it also introduces the challenge of moving forward after years defined by incarceration. Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline each emerge from the case with lives that have been irrevocably altered, their experiences shaped by a system that both convicted and later released them. This aspect of the case underscores the human impact of judicial error, moving beyond abstract discussions of process and evidence to the lived reality of those involved. It raises questions about how such harm can be addressed, about the extent to which a correction can compensate for the time that has been lost, and about the responsibilities of the system in acknowledging and responding to those consequences. These questions do not have simple answers, but they are integral to understanding the full scope of a case. At the same time, the case continues to center on the loss of Dana Ireland. Her absence remains the constant around which all other elements revolve. The investigation, the trial, the exonerations, all exist because of the violence that took her life. In this sense, the later developments in the case, while significant, do not change its origin. They add layers of meaning, but they do not alter the fundamental reality of what occurred. The interplay between these different elements creates a narrative that resists simplification. It is not a story that moves cleanly from crime to justice, but one that moves through stages of understanding, each revealing new aspects of the case. The initial certainty of the convictions gives way to doubt. The doubt leads to reevaluation, and the reevaluation leads to a more complex form of clarity, one that acknowledges both what is known and what remains unresolved. In examining this progression, the case becomes a reflection of the broader challenges inherent in the pursuit of justice. It highlights the importance of evidence, but also the ways in which evidence can be interpreted. It demonstrates the role of technology in shaping outcomes, but also the limitations that exist when that technology is not yet fully developed. It shows how narratives are constructed, but also how they can be deconstructed when new information emerges. The enduring significance of the case lies in this complexity. It is not defined by a single outcome, but by the interaction of multiple outcomes, each contributing to a fuller understanding. The wrongful convictions, the later exonerations, the identification of a different suspect, all coexist within the same narrative, each representing a different stage in the process of understanding what happened. As time continues to pass, the case remains a point of reference, a reminder of both the potential and the limitations of the systems designed to respond to crime. It serves as an example of how those systems can function effectively, but also of how they can fail, and how those failures can be addressed over time. It is a case that invites continued reflection, not because it lacks answers, but because the answers it provides are themselves complex and multifaceted. In the end, the story of Dana Ireland is one that extends beyond the specifics of a single event. It becomes part of a larger conversation about truth, justice, and the processes that connect them. It is a story that does not end with a single conclusion, but continues to resonate, shaped by the lessons it offers and the questions it leaves behind. In the final layer of reflection on the case of Dana Ireland, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a convergence of truths that do not fully align into a simple resolution. The passage of time has clarified certain aspects, while leaving others permanently beyond reach. The violence of that night on a remote road in the Puna district of Big Island is no longer in question. The suffering endured, the injuries sustained, and the loss that followed are fixed points in the narrative. What has changed is the understanding of everything that came after, the recognition that the path from crime to conclusion was not as direct as it once appeared. The evolution of this case reveals something fundamental about how stories are constructed within the justice system. In the immediate aftermath of a crime, there is a need for coherence, for a narrative that can explain what happened and who was responsible. That need is not abstract. It is driven by urgency, by the expectations of a community, by the demands placed on investigators to provide answers. In such an environment, the available pieces of information are assembled into a structure that can support a conclusion. In the case of Dana Ireland, That structure initially pointed toward Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline, creating a narrative that seemed to resolve the uncertainties of the case. What later emerged, however, was that this structure had been built on elements that did not fully withstand scrutiny. The confessions that had once been treated as definitive were revealed to be inconsistent and potentially unreliable. The forensic evidence, which had not been decisive at the time, later provided a different direction when re-examined with more advanced methods. This shift did not simply alter the outcome of the case, it exposed the fragility of the narrative that had been constructed, demonstrating how conclusions can be shaped by the limitations of the information available at a given moment. The introduction of DNA analysis as a central factor in the reevaluation of the case represents one of the most significant turning points in its history. The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer as the source of the biological evidence provided a level of specificity that had been absent before. It offered a direct link between an individual and the crime, something that could not be achieved through confessions alone. Yet even this clarity came with limitations. His death before prosecution meant that the legal system could not complete the process of accountability, leaving the case in a state where the evidence pointed toward a conclusion that could not be formally adjudicated. This outcome creates a tension between knowledge and closure. On one hand, there is a clearer understanding of who was responsible for the attack on Dana Ireland. On the other hand, there is no final legal judgment that confirms this responsibility within the framework of the justice system. The case, therefore, occupies a space between resolution and incompleteness, where the truth is more visible than it once was, but still not fully resolved in the way that legal processes typically require. For the individuals who were wrongfully convicted, this tension is experienced in a deeply personal way. The exoneration of Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline represents a formal acknowledgement that the conclusions reached in their cases were incorrect. It restores their legal status, but it does not erase the years they spent in prison, the impact those years had on their lives, or the difficulty of reconstructing a sense of normalcy after such an experience. Their stories become part of the larger narrative, illustrating the human cost of error within the justice system. At the same time, the case continues to center on the absence of Dana Ireland. Her life, interrupted by violence, remains the reason the case exists at all. The developments that followed, the investigations, the trials, the exonerations, all stem from that single event. While the later stages of the case focus on correcting mistakes and identifying a likely perpetrator, they do not change the fundamental reality of her loss. This distinction is important, as it ensures that the narrative does not shift entirely toward the process at the expense of the person at its center. The broader implications of the case extend beyond its specific details. It serves as an example of how the pursuit of justice can be influenced by a range of factors, including the limitations of available technology, the pressures placed on investigators, and the ways in which evidence is interpreted. It also demonstrates the importance of maintaining a system that allows for reevaluation, that recognizes the possibility of error and provides mechanisms for correcting it when new information becomes available. At the same time, the case highlights the challenges inherent in achieving a complete sense of justice. Even with the correction of wrongful convictions and the identification of a likely perpetrator, there are elements that remain unresolved. The absence of a trial for James Dennis Schweitzer means that the legal process does not reach a definitive conclusion. The time lost by those who were wrongfully convicted cannot be restored. The life of Dana Ireland cannot be returned. These limitations underscore the reality that justice, as an ideal, is often constrained by the circumstances in which it is pursued. In this final reflection, the case can be understood as both a specific event and a broader lesson. It is the story of a crime that occurred on a quiet road, of an investigation that sought to explain it, of a trial that reached a conclusion, and of a later reevaluation that challenged that conclusion. It is also a story about the systems that respond to such events, about their strengths and their weaknesses, about their capacity to both resolve and complicate the search for truth. The enduring impact of the case lies in this duality. It demonstrates that understanding is not static, that it can change as new information emerges and as perspectives shift. It shows that the pursuit of justice is not a single moment, but an ongoing process, one that can involve correction as well as conclusion. And it reminds us that even when answers are found, they may not fully resolve the questions that gave rise to them. In the end, the story of Dana Ireland remains open in a way that few cases are. Not because the facts are entirely unknown, but because the meaning of those facts continues to evolve. It is a case that resists a simple ending, one that remains defined by both what has been discovered and what cannot be undone. And in that complexity, it continues to hold significance, not only as a record of what happened, but as a reflection of how we seek to understand and respond to such events, even when the answers are incomplete. In the continued examination of the case of Dana Ireland, what becomes increasingly clear is that its legacy does not rest solely in the answers it eventually provided, but in the questions it continues to raise. These questions extend beyond the specifics of a single investigation or a single legal proceeding. They reach into the broader structure of how justice is pursued, how certainty is established, and how that certainty can later be undone when new information emerges. The case becomes not only a narrative of events, but a reflection of the processes that attempt to define those events. At the heart of this reflection lies the recognition that the original conclusions, once accepted as definitive, were shaped by a combination of factors that did not fully align with the truth later revealed. The confessions that formed the foundation of the case against Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline were central to that process. They provided a narrative that could be presented in court, a sequence of events that appeared to explain the crime. Yet their inconsistencies, their shifting details, and the questions surrounding how they were obtained suggest that they were not as reliable as they were once believed to be. This raises a fundamental issue about the role of confession in criminal investigations. A confession, by its nature, carries a powerful weight. It is often seen as direct evidence of involvement, a statement that connects an individual to a crime in a way that other forms of evidence may not. But the case of Dana Ireland demonstrates that this weight can be misleading, particularly when the conditions under which a confession is obtained are not fully transparent or when the content of the confession does not align consistently with other available evidence. The reliance on such statements, especially in the absence of strong corroborating forensic evidence, becomes a point of vulnerability within the investigative process. The later introduction of DNA analysis into the case provides a stark contrast to this earlier reliance. The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer through genetic evidence represents a form of clarity that is less dependent on interpretation. Unlike confessions, which can be influenced by a range of factors, DNA evidence offers a direct connection that is not subject to the same kinds of variability. This contrast highlights the importance of grounding investigations in evidence that can be independently verified, reducing the reliance on elements that may be more subjective in nature. However, even this clarity does not fully resolve the case. The inability to bring James Dennis Schweitzer to trial due to his death means that the legal process remains incomplete. This introduces a different kind of limitation, one that is not related to the quality of evidence, but to the circumstances in which that evidence emerges. It underscores the reality that justice is not only about identifying the truth, but also about the ability to act on that truth within a specific time frame. When that time frame has passed, the options available to the legal system become more constrained. For the individuals who were wrongfully convicted, the passage from conviction to exoneration represents a profound shift, but one that does not fully restore what was lost. Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline each experienced years of incarceration based on a narrative that was later proven to be flawed. Their release acknowledges that flaw, but it does not erase the impact of those years. This aspect of the case highlights the long-term consequences of error within the justice system, demonstrating that even when corrections are made, they cannot fully undo the effects of earlier decisions. At the same time, the case continues to center on the absence of Dana Ireland. Her life, interrupted by violence, remains the constant around which all other elements revolve. The investigation, the trial, the exonerations, and the later identification of a different suspect all exist because of what happened to her. This central fact ensures that the narrative does not drift entirely into an abstract discussion of process and error. It remains grounded in the reality of a life lost, a loss that cannot be mitigated by any later developments. The interplay between these different elements creates a case that is both specific and symbolic. It is specific in its details, in the events that took place, in the individuals involved, in the evidence that was collected and later re-examined. It is symbolic in what it represents, a broader commentary on how justice is pursued, how it can succeed, and how it can fail. This dual nature allows the case to function as both a historical record and a point of reflection, offering insights that extend beyond its immediate context. One of the most significant aspects of this reflection is the recognition that the pursuit of justice is an evolving process. The tools and methods available at one point in time are not the same as those available later. The understanding of how to interpret evidence, how to conduct interrogations, and how to evaluate the reliability of different forms of information can change. The case of Dana Ireland illustrates how these changes can alter the course of an investigation, leading to outcomes that differ significantly from those initially reached. This evolution, however, is not automatic. It requires a willingness to revisit past conclusions, to question what has been accepted, and to apply new methods to old evidence. In this sense, the case also reflects the importance of maintaining a system that is open to reevaluation, that recognizes the possibility of error and provides mechanisms for addressing it. Without such a system, the original conclusions might have remained unchallenged, and the later developments that brought greater clarity might never have occurred. As the case continues to be examined, it serves as a reminder of both the potential and the limitations of the justice system. It shows that the system is capable of correcting itself, of acknowledging mistakes and taking steps to address them. At the same time, it demonstrates that these corrections can come only after significant time has passed, and that the consequences of earlier errors can persist even after they are recognized. In the end, the case of Dana Ireland does not resolve into a single, definitive narrative. Instead, it remains layered, its different elements coexisting in a way that reflects the complexity of the events and the processes that followed. It is a story of violence, of investigation, of error, and of correction. It is a story that continues to invite reflection, not because it lacks answers, but because the answers it provides are themselves part of a larger, more complicated understanding of what it means to seek justice in a world where certainty is not always immediately available. In drawing closer to the final reflections on the case of Dana Ireland, the story begins to take on a quieter, more introspective tone, one that moves beyond the sequence of events and into the meaning those events carry over time. The details remain unchanged: the attack on a remote road in the Puna district of Big Island, the investigation that followed, the convictions that once appeared to resolve the case, and the later discoveries that unraveled those conclusions. But what changes is the perspective, the way in which these elements are understood not only as parts of a case, but as parts of a larger pattern that speaks to how truth is pursued and how it can be obscured. The case illustrates how easily a narrative can take hold when it aligns with the need for closure. In the early stages, when Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline were identified, questioned, and ultimately convicted, the story seemed to settle into place. There was a sense that the unknown had been replaced by the known, that the uncertainty surrounding the crime had been resolved through the identification of those responsible. This sense of resolution is powerful, not only for those directly involved in the case, but for the broader community that looks to the justice system for answers. Yet the later developments reveal how that sense of resolution can be premature. The inconsistencies in the confessions, the limitations of the forensic evidence at the time, and the eventual re-examination of the DNA all point to a reality that is more complex than the initial narrative suggested. The case becomes an example of how certainty can be constructed in the absence of complete information, how the need for answers can lead to conclusions that are later shown to be incomplete or incorrect. The introduction of DNA evidence into the case marks a moment of clarity, but also a moment of contrast. The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer through genetic material provides a direct connection that had been missing before. It offers a level of specificity that does not rely on interpretation in the same way that confessions do. But even this clarity is not absolute, because it exists within the constraints of time. His death before prosecution means that the legal system cannot fully act on this information, leaving the case in a state where the truth is more visible, but not fully resolved within the structures designed to confirm it. This duality, clarity without closure, becomes one of the defining features of the case. It raises questions about what it means to resolve a case, about whether resolution is defined by the identification of a perpetrator, the completion of a legal process, or some combination of both. In the case of Dana Ireland, these elements do not fully align. The identification of a likely perpetrator does not lead to a trial, and the correction of wrongful convictions does not restore what was lost. The result is a narrative that resists a simple conclusion, one that remains open in certain respects even as it becomes more defined in others. For those who were wrongfully convicted, the process of exoneration represents a significant shift, but it also highlights the limitations of that shift. Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline were released, their convictions overturned or reduced in light of new evidence. This represents a formal acknowledgement that the earlier conclusions were not supported by the facts. But the years they spent in prison remain part of their lives, a reminder that the correction of an error does not erase its impact. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of humility within the pursuit of justice. The initial investigation and trial were conducted within the context of the knowledge and tools available at the time, but they were also influenced by the assumptions and interpretations of those involved. The later developments show that those assumptions were not entirely accurate, that the conclusions drawn from them required revision. This suggests that any conclusion, no matter how well supported it may appear at the time, should remain open to reevaluation in light of new evidence. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of persistence. The reevaluation of the evidence, the application of new forensic methods, and the willingness to revisit past conclusions all played a role in uncovering the inaccuracies in the original narrative. Without these efforts, the case might have remained as it was initially understood, its errors uncorrected. This persistence reflects a commitment to truth that extends beyond the immediate resolution of a case, recognizing that justice is not only about reaching a conclusion, but about ensuring that the conclusion is as accurate as possible. Throughout all of these developments, the presence of Dana Ireland remains central. Her life, interrupted by violence, is the reason the case exists at all. The discussions of investigation, evidence, and error do not change that fact. They provide context, they offer insight into how the case was handled, but they do not alter the fundamental reality of her loss. This centrality ensures that the case remains grounded, that it does not become solely an abstract examination of process, but remains connected to the human impact at its core. In reflecting on the case as a whole, it becomes clear that it does not offer a simple lesson. Instead, it presents a series of interconnected insights, each contributing to a broader understanding of how justice is pursued and how it can be challenged. It shows that the search for truth is often complex, that it can involve both progress and setback, that it requires both certainty and doubt. It demonstrates that the systems designed to address crime are capable of both success and error, and that the recognition of those errors is an essential part of their function. The story of Dana Ireland, therefore, becomes more than a record of what happened on a single night. It becomes a reflection on how such events are understood, how they are interpreted, and how those interpretations can change over time. It is a story that continues to resonate, not because it lacks answers, but because the answers it provides are part of a larger, ongoing process of understanding. And in that process, it serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a fixed point, but a journey, one that requires constant attention, reflection, and a willingness to confront the complexities that arise along the way. In the final stretch of reflection on the case of Dana Ireland, what remains is a quiet but persistent tension between what is known and what can never be fully resolved. The facts, as they stand after years of investigation and re-examination, form a clearer picture than they once did. The advances in forensic science have narrowed uncertainty, the wrongful convictions have been addressed, and the direction of responsibility has shifted toward James Dennis Schweitzer. Yet even with this clarity, the case does not settle into a definitive ending. Instead, It lingers in a space shaped by both revelation and limitation, where understanding exists alongside absence. The early narrative, once built around Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline, now stands as a reminder of how easily certainty can form under pressure. Their convictions were not the result of a single error, but of a series of decisions, each reinforcing the next, each contributing to a structure that appeared solid at the time. The reliance on confessions that contained inconsistencies, the absence of conclusive forensic evidence, and the broader context of urgency surrounding the case all played a role in shaping that structure. When it was later dismantled, it revealed not only the flaws within it, but the processes that had allowed those flaws to persist. The introduction of DNA evidence did more than alter the outcome of the case. It changed the framework through which the case could be understood. The identification of James Dennis Schweitzer provided a form of specificity that had been missing, a direct link that could not be easily dismissed or reinterpreted. This shift underscores the transformative impact of technological advancement within the justice system, demonstrating how new methods can bring clarity to situations that once seemed resolved but were, in fact, incomplete. However, this clarity is not without its own limitations. The inability to bring James Dennis Schweitzer to trial introduces a sense of incompleteness that cannot be fully addressed. The legal system, which had once moved forward with confidence in its conclusions, now finds itself in a position where the evidence points toward a likely perpetrator, but the formal mechanisms of accountability cannot be applied. This creates a gap between knowledge and resolution, one that defines the final state of the case. For the individuals who were wrongfully convicted, the conclusion of the case is equally complex. The exoneration of Albert Ian Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline represents a significant correction, a recognition that the narrative that once defined their lives was not supported by the evidence. Yet this correction does not erase the years they spent within that narrative, the time lost to incarceration, the impact on their identities and their futures. Their stories become a testament to the enduring consequences of error, illustrating that even when justice is eventually pursued in a more accurate direction, it does not fully undo what has already occurred. At the center of all these developments remains Dana Ireland, whose life was taken in a moment that set all of this into motion. The investigation, the trial, the later reevaluation, all exist because of that singular event. While the focus of the narrative may shift over time, moving from the crime itself to the processes that followed, the core of the case remains unchanged. Her absence is the constant, the element that anchors the story even as its surrounding details evolve. The broader implications of the case extend into how society understands justice itself. It challenges the idea that justice is a linear process, moving cleanly from crime to resolution. Instead, it presents a more complicated picture, one in which conclusions can be reached and later reconsidered, in which certainty can give way to doubt, and in which the final understanding of a case may differ significantly from its initial interpretation. This perspective does not diminish the importance of the justice system, but it does highlight the need for caution, for openness to reevaluation, and for an awareness of the limitations that exist within any process. The case also underscores the importance of time as a factor in understanding. The years that passed between the original convictions and the later exonerations were not empty. They were filled with the gradual accumulation of questions, the development of new methods, and the persistence of those who sought to revisit the evidence. This passage of time allowed for a deeper examination, one that ultimately led to a more accurate understanding of the case. At the same time, it also meant that the consequences of earlier decisions had time to take root, affecting the lives of those involved in ways that could not be reversed. In its final form, the case of Dana Ireland becomes a narrative that resists simplicity. It is not a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but one that loops back on itself, revisiting earlier conclusions and reshaping them in light of new information. It is a story that contains both resolution and uncertainty, both clarity and absence. It is, in many ways, a reflection of the complexities inherent in any attempt to understand human actions and the systems designed to respond to them. And so, as the narrative reaches its conclusion, It does not do so with a sense of finality, but with a recognition of what has been learned and what remains beyond reach. The identification of a likely perpetrator, the correction of wrongful convictions, and the acknowledgement of past errors all contribute to a more complete understanding of the case. Yet the absence of a formal trial, the irreversible loss of life, and the time that cannot be restored ensure that the case remains, in some respects, unfinished. It is within this unfinished quality that the case continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth is not always a straight path, that it can involve missteps and corrections, that it requires both determination and humility. It reminds us that justice, while a goal, is not always fully attainable in the way we might hope, that it can be shaped by circumstance as much as by intention. In the end, the story of Dana Ireland endures not because it offers a perfect resolution, but because it does not. It remains as a testament to the complexities of seeking truth, to the challenges of ensuring justice, and to the enduring impact of events that cannot be undone. And in that endurance, it continues to hold meaning, not only for those directly connected to the case, but for anyone who seeks to understand how such stories unfold and what they reveal about the systems and people involved.